What happens when a man slaps a 78-year-old woman in front of a full diner and nobody moves to stop him? I found out exactly what happens because that woman was my mother, and I command soldiers for a living. Before I tell you the rest, hit like on this video. Subscribe if stories about quiet people finally standing up hit something in you, and share this with someone who needs to hear that silence is not the same thing as weakness. Now let me take you back to the day my whole world cracked open. My name is Colonel Renee Ashford. I have spent 22 years in the United States Army, the last 6 of them commanding a Ranger battalion. I have led soldiers through places I still don't talk about at family dinners. I have made decisions under pressure that most people will never have to make in their entire lives. But nothing, prepared me for a phone call I got on a Tuesday afternoon in early October, while I was reviewing training schedules in my office at Fort Benning. My Aunt Carol was on the other end of the line, and her voice didn't sound like her voice at all. She kept starting sentences and stopping them, the way people do when the thing they need to say is too big for the words they have. Finally, she just sent me a video instead of finishing her sentence, and I watched it standing at my desk with my hand pressed flat against the wood, like I needed something solid to hold on to. It was 11 seconds long. My mother, Dorothy Ashford, standing behind the counter of the diner she has run for almost 40 years, the same diner where I grew up doing homework in a corner booth while she flipped eggs and refilled coffee for half the town. A man, maybe 35, well-dressed, red in the face, leaning over that counter with his finger jabbing toward her chest. And then, before I even understood what I was watching, his open hand came across her face so fast and so hard that she went down behind the counter, out of frame, and the phone kept recording the empty space where she used to be standing. 11 seconds. I have replayed longer moments in combat that felt shorter than that video. I need to tell you something about my mother, because it matters for everything that comes after. Dorothy Ashford is not a soft woman. She raised 3 kids alone after my father passed when I was 9, and she built that diner up from a rundown roadside shack into the kind of place where 3 generations of the same families still come every single Sunday. She has never once, not one single time in my entire life, asked anyone for help she didn't absolutely need. So when I called her that night and heard her voice shaking, trying to tell me it was nothing, that I shouldn't fly home over some silly misunderstanding, I knew exactly how bad it actually was. Because my mother minimizing pain is the loudest alarm bell I know. I filed for emergency leave that same hour. I did not wait for the paperwork to clear through normal channels. I called in favors I had been saving for years, and by the next morning I was on a flight home, still in my service uniform because I hadn't had time to change, staring out the window at clouds and thinking about every soldier I had ever trained to stay calm under fire, and wondering if I could actually manage to stay calm myself. The hospital in our small town smelled exactly the way small hospitals always smell, like bleach trying to cover something it can't quite cover. I found my mother's room on the 2nd floor. She had a fractured wrist from bracing her fall, a bruise spreading dark along her cheekbone, and when she saw me walk in wearing my uniform, her face did something I wasn't prepared for. It wasn't relief. It was worry, deep and immediate, the kind only a mother carries, even from a hospital bed with a broken wrist. "You didn't need to come all this way for this," she said, her voice thin but stubborn. I sat down beside her and took her uninjured hand, and I told her plainly that somebody hit her in her own restaurant, and I intended to find out exactly who, and exactly why, and exactly what was going to happen to him. She looked away from me toward the window for a long moment, and then she said something that has stuck with me every day since. "Please, Renee, don't stir up more than this town can handle. Some things are bigger than one slap." Those words told me everything I needed to know. This was never about one man losing his temper. This was about something underneath the surface of our town that had been sitting there quietly for a long time, and my mother, in her own careful way, had just told me so. If you've ever had someone you love ask you to stay quiet about something that was hurting them, just to protect you from what came next, drop a comment below telling me who that person was for you. I read every single one, and I promise you, this story is about to show you exactly why staying quiet is sometimes the most dangerous choice of all. The diner, Next morning felt like a room full of people holding their breath. I walked in wearing plain clothes, no rank, no uniform, just jeans and an old sweater, because I wanted to see how people actually behaved when they thought no one important was watching. My mother's longtime waitress, a woman named Teresa who had worked there since I was in middle school, wouldn't meet my eyes when I asked her what she'd seen. "I was in the back," she said, wiping down a counter that didn't need wiping. Two regulars in a corner booth, men who had eaten breakfast at that counter every single day of my childhood, gave me the exact same answer in almost the exact same words. "Didn't see a thing." I want you to sit with that for a moment because it matters. An entire diner full of familiar faces, people my mother had fed on credit during hard months, people who had watched me grow up, and every single one of them had apparently developed sudden simultaneous blindness the moment a man's hand connected with an old woman's face. That is not coincidence. That is fear, and fear like that doesn't grow on its own. Someone plants it, and someone waters it over years. I asked to see the diner's security footage, and the building's owner, who leases the space to my mother, told me the system had conveniently malfunctioned that exact afternoon. I went to the sheriff's department next, and Sheriff Roy Callahan gave me the kind of sympathetic, empty smile that men give when they've already decided not to help you before you've finished your sentence. "Sometimes elderly folks lose their footing," he said, as if my mother's fractured wrist had come from a stumble instead of a slap caught on video. Without solid evidence, he told me, there wasn't much of a case to build. 22 years in the military teaches you to read a room. It teaches you to notice when a man's hands are too still, when his eyes won't hold yours, when his sympathy is a rehearsed line rather than a real feeling. Sheriff Callahan wasn't incompetent. He was protecting something, and I intended to find out exactly what. That night, sitting at my mother's kitchen table with a cold cup of coffee, there was a soft knock at the door. It was a young woman named Bailey, who used to babysit down the street when I was a teenager, and who now worked part-time at the diner. She was nervous, glancing over her shoulder before she even stepped inside. She handed me her phone, already open to a longer video than the one that had gone viral. "I've been scared to show anyone," she said quietly. "But your mom's always been kind to me, and I can't stay quiet anymore." In the background of that longer clip, half hidden near the pie case, stood a tall man in an expensive gray coat, watching the entire assault unfold with his arms folded and absolutely no expression on his face. Not shock, not concern, just patience, like he was watching something proceed exactly according to a plan he had already approved. Bailey told me his name before she left that night: Nathaniel Cross. The man who quietly owned nearly every piece of commercial property in our county. And, as it turned out, most of the people meant to hold him accountable for anything at all. I didn't sleep much after that. I sat at that kitchen table with a legal pad, doing what 22 years of military intelligence work had trained me to do instinctively. Building a picture, one small piece at a time, refusing to let a single detail slip past me unexamined. The next morning, I went to the county records office, and I spent nearly 7 hours under buzzing fluorescent lights, reading through property transfers, permit filings, and zoning approvals, while a clerk kept glancing at me like she wasn't sure whether to help me or quietly warn someone that I was there. By the end of that day, a pattern had emerged that I could not unsee. Over 24 families across nearly 5 years had sold land to a company called Cross Holdings under circumstances that all shared the exact same strange shape. A family refuses an offer. Something happens shortly after: a fire, a sudden lien, an accident, a threat dressed up as bad luck. Within months, that family's name appears on a new deed, land transferred at a fraction of its actual worth. Every single case had passed quietly through the sheriff's department, closed fast, no follow-up questions asked. Every permit Nathaniel Cross ever needed had been signed without delay by our town's mayor. And then I found my father's name. Buried in a filing from years earlier, tied to a strip of land adjoining our family property, land that Nathaniel Cross had wanted badly enough to send 3 separate offers within a few short months. My father had refused every single one. A handwritten note from an assessor's visit read, "Owner uncooperative, recommends further pressure." 3 weeks after that note was dated, My father died in a single car accident on a familiar stretch of road he had driven 10,000 times before. On a clear night alone. I had believed for over a decade that I lost my father to bad luck. That belief cracked wide open sitting in that kitchen, staring at the word uncooperative, until I could hear nothing else in my own head. If this story is pulling something loose in you, I want you to do something for me right now. Share this video with one person in your life who has ever been told to just let something go for the sake of peace. Sometimes the bravest thing we can do for someone we love is refuse to let them carry silence alone. 2 days later, a retired attorney named Walter Grimes showed up at my mother's door. He had practiced law in this county for nearly 4 decades before Nathaniel Cross, in his own words, made honest practice impossible here. He sat across from me at that same kitchen table and opened an old leather satchel like a man finally setting down something he had carried for far too long. "Your father came to me about 6 weeks before he died," Walter told me quietly. He'd uncovered the whole scheme, the falsified appraisals, the payments to the sheriff's department, the permits signed in exchange for a cut of every deal. He handed me photocopied contracts with mismatched signatures, dates that didn't line up, and beneath all of it, a small, worn recorder. "Your father recorded the last meeting he ever attended," Walter said. "I've kept this in a safety deposit box for years, waiting for someone in your family strong enough, or angry enough, to come looking. Then I saw your name attached to that video online, Colonel, and I thought maybe now." I sat holding that recorder in both hands, feeling the weight of 6 years of silence finally exhale out of it. "He knew," I said, not really a question. "He knew everything," Walter answered. "And I believe, though I could never prove it in a courtroom on its own, that it's exactly why he isn't here anymore." I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment. It would be easy to tell you it was pure rage, the kind that makes for a satisfying story. But it wasn't only rage. It was grief, fresh as the week we buried him, tangled together with a strange, quiet relief, the relief of finally understanding a shape I had been staring at for years without truly seeing it. My father hadn't died from bad luck. He had died protecting something, and without ever telling a soul, he had left behind exactly the evidence his family would need to finish what he started. I decided that morning to keep my rank quiet a while longer. Not as strategy at first, but because I wanted to see this town the way my mother saw it every single day, without a uniform standing between me and the truth of how people actually behaved. So I walked into that diner in plain clothes the next morning, sat in a corner booth, and waited. My mother was back at work already, against every piece of advice from her doctor, her wrist still wrapped, moving behind that counter with a stubbornness I clearly inherited. The bell over the door rang, and Nathaniel Cross's nephew, the very man from the video, walked in like he owned the building, which in every practical sense he believed he did. "Well, look who's still standing," he said to my mother, sliding onto a stool with an easy grin that made my skin crawl precisely because of how comfortable it was. My mother's hand went still around the coffee pot. I stood up from that corner booth and walked over, close enough that he had to turn to face me. "You must be the one who hit my mother," I said, my voice level and flat, the same tone I use when briefing officers on news they don't want to hear. Something flickered behind his eyes, but his grin didn't fully die. "Around here," he said, leaning back like he was doing me a favor, "people who ask too many questions tend to have accidents. Ask your father." The room went completely silent. "My father died 6 years ago," I said, keeping my voice even, though every word he'd just spoken rearranged itself into a confession I understood with total clarity. "Car accidents happen," he said, smiling wider now, especially to people who don't know when to leave things alone. I did not raise my voice. I looked at him the way I have looked at hostile commanders across a negotiating table, and I said quietly, "The law is coming. It's just a little late." That is the exact moment 2 black SUVs pulled into the gravel lot outside, engines idling, and every head in that diner turned toward the windows. A man in army dress uniform stepped out and walked in, removing his cap. "Good afternoon, Colonel Ashford," he said, loud enough for the entire room to hear. I watched every face in that diner rearrange itself in real time, because a quiet woman in a corner booth was easy to dismiss. But a decorated Ranger Battalion commander was something else entirely. I want to be clear about something important here, because it shapes everything that happened next. I did not bring soldiers home to fight a civilian war. My father's own warning had been sitting in my chest for days. The uniform is a promise, not a weapon for revenge. I made calls instead to people whose entire job is untangling exactly this kind of corruption. A contact from my officer training days now worked with federal investigators, and within a week, she connected me to an FBI field office 2 counties over. I handed over everything: the recorder, the land records, the falsified contracts, and an agent named Patricia Nakamura told me 6 words I will never forget. Send me everything you have. Within days, a preliminary inquiry opened into potential racketeering, and the sheriff's department was flagged for review going back nearly a decade. Investigators traced wire transfers between cross-holdings and personal accounts connected to Sheriff Callahan and our mayor, patterns too regular to be coincidence, always timed within weeks of a new land transfer. Meanwhile, something happened that none of us had planned for. Bailey's longer video spread far beyond our town, picked up eventually by a national outlet hunting for a story about small-town corruption. I did not orchestrate that spread, but it gave other people courage. A farming family who had lost land under suspiciously similar circumstances came forward publicly. Then another family. Then another. One by one, people who had been carrying silence alone for years finally understood they were never alone in what they had witnessed. If you have ever watched fear keep good people quiet, and then watched one person finally break that silence open, I want you to comment below with the word courage, because I want to know how many of you have seen exactly this happen in your own life. Sheriff Callahan panicked 2 weeks into the inquiry, caught on a night deputy's phone hauling boxes of physical files out of the evidence room into his personal car at 11 at night. It didn't matter. Federal investigators already had copies of everything, because Walter Grimes, in a habit born from decades of watching corrupt men bury evidence, had made 3 separate sets of duplicates stored across different safety deposit boxes in 2 different states. Paper only disappears, he told me, if you only ever keep 1 copy. The arrests came on an ordinary Monday morning. Nathaniel Cross's nephew was taken into custody first, at the gym, without incident. Nathaniel Cross himself had lawyers stalling for hours, but by mid-morning he was walked out of his own office in restraints, past a small crowd that had gathered on the sidewalk, people who had watched his car pass by for years without ever once meeting his eyes. Sheriff Callahan was arrested at his home. 2 county officials went down alongside him, men whose signatures appeared on every convenient permit Cross had ever needed. Our mayor resigned that same afternoon, reading a statement heavy with the word misunderstanding and light on the word accountability. Federal charges followed anyway. My father's recording turned out to be the single most important piece of evidence in the entire case, an unmistakable confession captured 6 years earlier by a man who must have understood, on some level, that he was documenting exactly the truth his family would one day need. I sat in a federal building the week those charges were formally filed, and heard an agent read a list that included racketeering, extortion, obstruction of justice, and finally, a reopened investigation into the exact circumstances of my father's death. Not yet a charge, an investigation. But after years of believing I had lost him to nothing more than bad luck, even that single word felt like something breaking open inside my chest. A year moves differently once you've watched a broken thing slowly get rebuilt. The diner closed for renovations that spring, not because it needed saving structurally, but because an entire town had quietly decided, almost without anyone officially deciding anything, that this small building deserved to be more than it had been. Donations arrived from 3 different states. A contractor who had grown up eating my mother's pancakes did the framing work for free. Letters came with checks folded inside, $5, $500, all carrying some version of the exact same sentence. Thank you for not staying quiet. I flew home for the reopening wearing my dress uniform, not for attention, but because my mother asked me to, and there are very few requests from that woman I have ever been able to refuse. The whole town showed up. My mother stood at the center of it, holding a pair of oversized scissors in her one steady hand, and cut a ribbon in front of a small bronze plaque mounted beside the door, right next to the same bell that has rung there since before I was born. Justice begins when one person refuses to stay silent, it read. I found a booth in the corner and ordered a slice of pie, letting the noise of the reopening wash over me, the way sunlight washes over a room after a long, dark winter. A little girl wandered over at some point, looking at my uniform with the unguarded curiosity only children still carry. Are you a soldier? She asked. I am, I told her. But that's not really why I'm here today. She tilted her head, waiting for something more. Then who are you? She asked. I thought about my father on our porch, telling me never to use my uniform for revenge. I thought about Walter's satchel, 3 sets of duplicates hidden across 2 states. I thought about Bailey standing nervously at a door, handing over a phone because my mother had always been kind to her. I'm just somebody's daughter, I told her, and she seemed perfectly satisfied with that answer, the way children usually are with simple truths that carry something much larger underneath. If there is one thing I want you to carry away from this story tonight, it is this. A slap in a diner was never really about one moment of cruelty. It was about what happens when one person, just one, finally refuses to let silence win. That refusal can ripple out further than anyone standing in that room could ever have imagined, and it can turn a broken town, a broken family, and a broken heart into something whole again. If this story moved you even half as much as it moved me to live it, tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight, and share this with someone who still believes that staying quiet is the safer choice. Subscribe if you want more stories like this one, because the world needs to hear that courage still exists, even in the quietest corners of it.